Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of For Your Consideration, the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm Mike Josick.
And I'm Dustin Friesenan.
Thanks for joining us. This week we're going to be covering The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring.
A.K.A. that movie that created Dungeons & Dragons, which was uncool, but then came back to make Dungeons & Dragons cool again.
Really?
It made fantasy cool, didn't it? Popularized it.
I have some gloating to do. I'll be right back.
Today we are finally having another guest on the show, and that is Kat MacDonald. She is a writer-editor for On Spec magazine, as well as other publications around town, and a professional dusting critic.
Hi! I like to think of myself more as a dedicated amateur.
She was paid for it, so she's officially a professional. That is how it works.
Might I add that you're looking really dumb today.
That hurts.
$5.
Right in the feelings.
And rolling the credits on that movie, it was directed by Peter Jackson, produced by Barry M. Osborne, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Tim Sanders. Screenplay was by Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson. Based on, of course, The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Starred Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Cate Blanchett, John Rhys-Davies, Billy Boyd, Dominic Moynihan, Orlando Bloom, Christopher Lee, Hugo Weaving, Sean Bean, Ian Holm, and Andy Serkis, among scores of others. Music was by Howard Shore. Cinematography was by Andrew Lesney. It was edited by John Gilbert, and released by New Line Cinema on 10th of December, 2001. The film currently rates number 50 on AFI's Top 100 Films of All Time.
And it also ranks number 20 on IMDb, Top 100.
But we don't care about that.
Not anymore. Take that, IMDb.
All right, now it's... well, first off, Kat, I want to welcome you. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
It's always good to have an extra body. It is customary for us to... Normally, I defer to Dustin right off the bat and ask him how the film is, but when we have a guest, the guest gets to go first. So, Kat.
Oh, goody.
How did you feel about The Fellowship of the Ring?
I genuinely love the Lord of the Rings movies. I read them when I was a small child. I'm a second-generation nerd, and my mom was just Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, go, as soon as kind of I'd proven I could read. And then when I heard they were making a film version, I was absolutely horrified. Like, there's no way you can fit all this into a movie. Of course, all this is mostly descriptions of trees, but, I mean, I was a kid at the time. And then we went to see Fellowship, and it was kind of everything that I loved about Lord of the Rings. These huge, spanning, epic vistas. This sense of freedom and adventure and journeying, and I love it. I think it's magnificent. One thing that I did kind of want to discuss with you guys is when Peter Jackson won the Oscar for Lord of the Rings, it was for Return of the King. Because it was kind of viewed as just like a stand-in for them to be able to say, Lord of the Rings was great as a whole experience. This is the one we're acknowledging.
I definitely think they held off till the last film, just in case they gave the Oscar to the first film, and then it was like, oh, the next film's even better. So yeah, you just recognize after the whole experience, and you're good to go.
The thing is, most people will say that The Return of the King was actually the worst of the three. And, certainly here we kind of agree that The Two Towers was probably the best.
That's kind of why I brought it up. It's like, are we talking strictly about Fellowship right now? Or are we talking about Fellowship as a kind of Oscars-esque gateway into talking about Lord of the Rings in general?
We are talking strictly about Fellowship. Should also point out we're talking about the theatrical edition of Fellowship, the 3-hour version, not the 3.5-hour version that came out on the extended editions, which, as I discussed with you guys before we sat down to do this, my experience prior to watching this film, I've watched the extended edition many, many times, and that's sort of what I kind of base my liking of this film on, and sitting down to watch the theatrical cut was kind of bracing. It was not how I remembered it. It was a totally new experience for me. Since seeing it in 2001, I don't think I'd seen it since then.
Amusingly enough, I actually haven't seen any of the extended editions for any of these yet. I've seen, I think, all of them twice, but never an extended cut. My dad was always talking about, there's going to be that one rainy day where we sit there and just 12 hours solid.
It's also super weird. We watched it on Netflix, and Netflix, in Canada anyways, has the regular theatrical edition for Fellowship, and then the extended cuts for both Two Towers and Return of the King. So that was, I don't know, I tweeted about that yesterday. It was just kind of like, WTF Netflix.
Well, they would have had the extended, but they knew that they wanted to save us some time and effort.
It must have been.
So I appreciate that, Netflix. Now you can put the extended up.
I think I went to a party back in college where we were gonna watch all of the extended editions of Lord of the Rings in one go. But if I remember right, I drank a bunch of Red Bull and passed out at the cave troll scene in Moria. And woke up halfway through the Two Towers.
That's funny that you say that, because when I was watching it last night, I passed out at the cave troll in Moria.
It's a good scene, too.
And I woke up again after the Balrog. And
was it Gandalf reading drums in the deep? And just slowly, okay, good night.
I want to be read to by a weird old guy.
The skeleton and the armor and the bucket and everything went down the hole, and the drums started, and everyone was getting ready, and the door was banging, and I must have passed out. I wasn't drinking either. And then I woke up after Gandalf had died in the Balrog and everything, and I was kind of like, whoa, kind of missed something there. But I just...
Spoilers, by the way.
No one can see me interlocking my hands.
It's a meaningful gesture. It means we're connected. The movies are really long, but they definitely don't suffer from the same catastrophic pacing flaws as the book, I think.
I don't think they're long, but they don't feel super long. I've been in movies which were an hour long and felt like this day just wouldn't end. And you can go into a movie like this where, yeah, it's 3 hours, but I'm not sitting there like, oh man, are they still just walking through the Shire here? Come on. No, I think that it kept you actually interested the entire time.
The reason why I think I've watched the extended edition as much as I have up to this point is because it lets the movie breathe a little more and the narrative sort of rolls out a little bit better. And I think that was one of my probably top 5 big takeaways from watching the film this time around, is that it's one of those cases where a 3-hour movie could actually use more content and not less.
I mean, back when it came out, we were like, 3 hours in a theater? Are you kidding me? That's stupid. And back in the day, they used to make 3-hour movies. They'd put intermissions in them so you could get up and go to the bathroom.
And that was before we even had 2-hour movies, which seems to be the standard now. It was 1.5 hour at the time.
But nowadays, you can make a 3-hour movie. People will go watch a 3-hour movie. And I think Fellowship and the Lord of the Rings trilogy in general can kind of be credited with warming us up to the idea.
I think films like Titanic and the Lord of the Rings movies did create that market again for ridiculously long movies.
Cleopatra had an intermission.
So did Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
That one was 4 hours. 3 hours and 58 minutes too long.
A 4-hour intermission.
One thing that I noticed immediately when we rewatched Fellowship was just how gorgeously it's shot. Like, they take full advantage of this New Zealand scenery. There's a lot of these wide framing, establishing shots. That was real clumsy, but I'm going to keep using articulate words. Like, his use of color is really kind of intense. You see the bright greens of the Shire kind of give way as the movie goes on and they get further away from home.
They give a very good sense of scale. Like, you know that they're traveling huge, long distances. Other movies are all these things next door. No, here you felt like, okay, yeah, they were traveling for 3 weeks. We just didn't see it.
Do we want to have a balanced going through the different aspects of the film sort of in any kind of order, or are we just going to jump around?
I mean, you
jump
guys
around.
know how it goes.
That's what we did. That's how we got into it.
we're just jumping. Like, are we supposed to be doing stuff?
You mentioned the scope, and you mentioned, well, you know, we could talk about the writing, we could talk about the acting, we could talk about, or we could just whatever comes to mind.
Okay.
So, which I guess we'll do.
I'm just talking about stuff.
You mentioned the scope and the, you know, showing the scenery. I mean,
that scenery from the shots.
That scenery is legendary. New Zealand still advertises itself as Middle Earth, and that scenery continues through the new Hobbit films, where, you know, one of the few endearing qualities of those movies is it has that beautiful New Zealand scenery that you can't find anywhere else. But I found myself being driven absolutely batshit crazy by all of the helicopter shots, which almost... Okay, the editing of this film. I remember loving this movie. I've long said that this was the best of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies. revisiting it, I now think Two Towers is probably the best
in the
of the three movies. And part of the reason for that is there were some really weird editing choices. There was some stuff that felt like filler. That whole Uruk-hai chase where they're on the river and the Uruk-hai are running, and they've got that weird, choppy, they've taken some frames out of the film to make it more dramatic or something. They're just doing these random helicopter shots going back and forth across the river, like back across the river, and then here come the Uruk-hai, and then we're going to go back across the river. It's not really giving any sense of real geography or tension or...
I think we weren't jumping around. I think we were talking about the same thing, like the movie's size. Like length, cutting that for length kind of diminished the sense of geographical continuity you're talking about. It kind of took away from that.
No, I'm talking about the way he's actually set up the scene. It's a chase. You're supposed to see them going down the river, and you're supposed to get the sense that the Uruk-hai are on their tail, and they're going to meet them, and there's going to be conflict. And you're supposed to feel tense. You're supposed to get the scope and the geography, but it just feels like really weird, haphazard editing styles.
I will agree that watching it, I had no... You know that Boromir and them are off in one side, and you've got Aragorn and Legolas on some other place, but you have no idea what the distance is between any of them, because Boromir is fighting a bunch of these guys for a while.
That's right.
It's like, how far split up did you guys get? Did you not stick together?
But you even mentioned to me, I think it was just before I went in to watch the film, and you said, pay close attention to the elven scenes.
Yes.
And I think it's, what I'm talking about is similar to what you were talking about then, which was they were using some very basic techniques that kind of took you out of the film. It was a lot more indie filmmaking and kind of B-movie technique.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas... which is what I meant with the editing. It's like they couldn't put it together or film it in such a way to show that chase in a more dramatic, interesting way, so they did it by using edits. Kind of like showing Liam Neeson jumping over a fence in Taken. There's 50 cuts in that 30-second scene. And it's the same with the, there's the beautiful matte paintings and the models and the costumes and the elves and the whatever. And then there's that horrible comped scene with the things and the floating and the, hello, Frodo. And
it was, I couldn't believe how bad it was when I saw Elrond's face just floating there. I'm like, it's like I'm watching a movie from the 50s, damn near. It's like Peter Jackson cannot do anything that isn't a practical effect. And his practical effects are astounding.
Usually.
I really appreciate that about Peter Jackson, actually. Like his dedication to using practical effects whenever possible, instead of just kind of blindly trusting CGI to be able to do a good enough job. But then he did those effects, like Elrond's weird floating head, or like Galadriel suddenly being inverted. And
we know that he can do proper editing. We saw a video on editing techniques, and shot for shot, sort of back and forth. You keep the heads the same size to give a sense of scale, and when you don't, it seems wrong. Whereas here, Peter Jackson knew that and had Frodo be a bit further away and Gandalf's head that much bigger, so you can get, once again, a sense of scale. He had that well done. They had the tricks with the table in Bilbo's home to make Gandalf look bigger than Bilbo. And he can edit that stuff well, but to have these weird editing things later on seems a little off.
It is. It's incongruous because you have these little achievements in... Like you said, they've got actors in the same room, probably 10 feet apart. They're turning to their left to talk to the character on their left, who's actually 10 feet ahead of them. And it works. I mean, the staging of it and the execution of it, but then they just throw in something weird, like these weird editing techniques or so much movement. I couldn't help but think of Sam Raimi while watching this movie, because so many of Jackson's shots were like those lock and zooms that Raimi does.
Now that you mention it, actually.
And there's a ton of them.
Lord of the Rings kind of has two major tones, and one of them is very medieval, European, down to earth, like the hobbits living in their little burrows.
Down to Middle Earth.
Wow. Ugh. But, and part of it is this mystical, rarefied, elegant world of the elves. And I think Peter Jackson is very good at one and not as good at the other. Because whenever something mystical is happening, he gets away from himself a little, and he does get a little weirdly cheesy on the effects. But if you're doing Hobbiton, Hobbiton's adorable. Hobbiton's a wonderful place.
I think the only thing that was sort of supernatural that I really just had no criticism of was anything to do with the ring wraiths and anytime Frodo put on the ring.
The fact that they had human faces that were more human when he put on the ring, that was...
Oh, I loved that.
I didn't notice that before. I think you pointed that out when we saw it, Kat, but that was actually really well done.
Yeah.
Another thing that kind of drove me a little bit nuts. I'm kind of working through like my 5 things that drove me nuts.
It's okay. Do this countdown.
I actually quite like Howard Shore's score. I love the Fellowship theme. I mean, you know, I hum it to myself occasionally. We've talked about me loving soundtracks. But it seemed like every 10 minutes there was this giant like crescendo of the Fellowship score. Somebody was like, I've just eaten lunch. And it'd be like, da-da-da, da-da-da. And like big close-ups and really emotional weepy faces with, you know, red lips and...
He's pinching his cheeks, audience.
I'm trying to blushed cheeks and just big blue shiny eyes and the music swelling and you're supposed to feel all this emotion and you can only like, it's kind of like the ending of Return of the King, just to sort of jump ahead a couple movies, where everyone kind of went nuts because there was 5 endings to that movie and you can only get so much of an emotional reaction out of someone so many times. And I think that they kind of milked that cow a little too many times in this movie.
It's like a death scene that goes on for 10 minutes.
Or like getting 10 death scenes that you're supposed to feel exactly the same about.
At the same time, though, I think one thing that he did really well with the score is that the second a fight isn't about the fight anymore, the music stops or the music fades. They keep kind of a very tight control over whether or not you're hearing music, whether or not that's what the scene is about right now. Same thing with like they stop playing fight sounds or they stop continuing focusing on battle when the scene isn't about battle anymore. And I think a lot of action movies don't really have timing that precise, which I appreciated. I liked it. It's like, this arrow has hit, now we're not worried about fighting orcs anymore. Now we're worried about Boromir being dead.
The spear hits
Spoilers.
Frodo, all of a sudden slows down.
He dies.
Everyone's focused about him. Oh crap, what's going on here? The fight kind of no longer relevant even. The fact that that spear would have crushed his ribs regardless of his armor, also irrelevant.
Lots of stuff is irrelevant. What else drove you nuts about the movie, Mike?
What number are we on here?
Okay, so there was the editing, the helicopter shots in the editing. There was score kind of taking it to 11 too many times. There was the close-ups, all the close-ups, so many close-ups, an unbelievable amount of close-ups, which then also cut to somebody with their open hand holding the ring.
Speaking of which, going back to the sound, when they drop the ring and it hits the ground and builds the heavy thud.
Yeah,
fantastic
just a little
touch.
touch.
Little touches.
Peter Jackson can be subtle.
Keep it secret. Keep it safe. So the close-ups were a crazy thing. Another one would be that I found the film, despite feeling like they took a very large novel with a lot of stuff going on and did a really good job of compressing it and getting kind of all that story in there, I think looking back on it, it comes off a little clunky. It actually reminds me a little bit of the original Star Wars in that a lot of the dialogue is clunky, a lot of it is expository. You're introducing all of these characters, and everybody who shows up has to be like, hi, I'm this person, and I'm related to this person, and I came from this place, and this place is related to everything else in this way. And everybody's like, hey, how you doing? I'm this person, and there's all this mention of lineage. And
Was it you saying it, Kat, when we were watching
Yeah,
it? Where it's
I was
like,
just gonna-
the Craigs of Dunmere over
Yeah,
here. It's like it's got to be the craziest names.
When Gollum is following them through Moria, and Frodo notices him, and he talks to Gandalf about it. And Gandalf's like, yeah, that's Gollum. He's been following us forever. It's no big deal. And Frodo's like, he escaped the dungeons of Barad-dûr? And I'm like, you didn't need to say that. Like, we don't, like, he escaped would have been fine there. But no, they had to mention the dungeons of Barad-dûr. And that's the way Lord of the Rings is written. And at places, you're right, it's excruciating. And I still love it.
I'm torn about that one because at times, I mean, I love Viggo Mortensen in this movie. Everybody loved Viggo Mortensen in this movie.
You can't not.
But watching his introduction, watching the first lines that Strider says in the Prancing Pony and a few of the things that came after, it's kind of clunky. And you get the feeling that these are actors who are learning these characters and everyone's learning how to make this movie, which, like I said, was very much like the original Star Wars. Empire Strikes Back had so much more drama and so much more like depth to the character, and we're all talking about Two Towers being the superior film here as well. So I kind of feel like it's a drawback, but I also kind of feel like it's a necessary evil when you're introducing everybody to a brand new world.
I mean, if you think about it, how many of the characters in the Fellowship do we really know nothing about? Certainly Legolas and Gimli. Like, there's no growth whatsoever. Gimli gets rather sad when he learns about his cousin's death, but other than that, they don't really have any moments at all.
One does not simply walk into
Mordor. Look, Gimli gets a little bit sad about his cousin's death, but we move on because Gimli's a comic relief character and we have other things to worry about. It's not ever taken seriously, which is terrible.
That is part of Peter Jackson's directing style. If you look back at his old movies, which are pretty much all like splatter comedies, he likes his little moments of dumb comedy, and he throws that in when Pippin and Merry are talking about, well, this is second breakfast. What about supper? Lunch? Afters? And like little stuff like that. 11s. They start wrestling with Boromir after a bit of training. Like little small stuff like that. You have a bit more of that later on. Like nobody tosses a dwarf in the future movies. That's part of Peter Jackson's style for sure.
Sorry, it's funny because you mentioned the training. My brain instantly went to a couple of seconds of training. And then the drums and the do-do-do, and them running across hills and fields and fjords. It's like... There's so much running and walking in this movie. With helicopter shots.
The thing is, as I said earlier, those helicopter shots, the little couple minutes of training and them just goofing off a little bit, it gives you the sense of this took a long time to do. And they bonded during this time. They trained Merry and Pippin a little bit during this time because they're just friggin' hobbits. They don't know how to fight. So later on, when they actually have to do something, it makes a bit of sense. Sure, here, Merry and Pippin just get booted once and they're down. But that also makes sense because you don't learn how to fight in a couple of weeks.
You know that fight scene that you mentioned earlier that you felt that was edited and there wasn't any visual continuity to it and you couldn't really make out who was where and where the orcs were. You know what would have helped that? Helicopter shots.
I was talking about before the actual fight. I don't mind the fight itself.
Oh, I know. But helicopter shots would have helped that, too.
They might have.
If we would have had just a HUD that showed the overlay of the map and then red dots where all the Uruk-hai were. Let's go straight video
cone
game.
To show where the hobbits can see.
The telestrator. Little John Madden commentary. I also don't feel that they, and again, I think this might play out better in the extended edition. I haven't seen it for a while. It might just be a necessary evil of adapting a very large book into 1 3-hour movie. But Boromir kind of going crazy, and I didn't feel like they earned it this time. This time, it didn't feel... I felt kind of like I was told that this is sort of the effect that it's having and that Boromir was bound to do this because Galadriel basically says, someone's going to betray you. I think you know who.
Well, Boromir, he also...
gesturing toward him with her neck. Look at this guy.
Boromir also set himself up a bit at the Council of Elrond where he's talking about, why don't we just use this ring? We can totally do that. Like, save my people. We're all dying. We need to use the ring. He's freaking out about that earlier. He sort of grudgingly accepts the plan as it is. This is his chance. So, honestly, I believe his build-up.
The conversation he has with Aragorn and Lothlorien, where he's talking about the pressure that's on him to save Gondor, I think they ramp up to it more than 0. But I also do kind of agree that it's very abrupt the moment that he does decide to ask for it and then immediately snap.
Although at that point you can still say they have also built up the ring's power and how the ring wants to be found. The ring doesn't want to get itself destroyed, so here's a dude who's sort of on the edge. It isn't that hard to push him over. So a little bit of a jump isn't that hard. It isn't that unbelievable.
No, and that's ultimately why I went along with it, because it makes sense. I just didn't feel brought into it properly, I guess.
But all of this talk is definitely pointing out they have this kind of small foreshadowing in different scenes that does help, which is a good thing.
Yeah, but... at the same time, how much of the original foreshadowing and establishment and development of a huge goddamn book can you fit into a movie? Even if it is a 3-hour movie, like,
And even if they did completely cut Tom Bombadil.
They completely cut Tom Bombadil. I like Tom Bombadil.
You know, one thing that I liked about this movie, there aren't a lot of movies where I really like Liv Tyler. I really like Liv Tyler in this movie.
That's a correct statement. That is an absolutely correct statement. Like, I really like Liv Tyler.
I totally buy her as an elf.
Yeah.
I love listening to her speaking in Elvish.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
I love the scene where she's telling Aragorn that she chooses to give up her immortality and she wants to live a mortal life because she'd rather live a finite time with him than forever without. And I was like, oh.
Aww.
I went into this liking Sean Bean a lot. I came out of it still liking Sean Bean a lot.
That's the
He
important
did not
thing.
let me down. I gained a real intense love of Sean Astin.
Oh, I know, right?
Oh my god. He was just so lovable as Sam. Like, the second he appears, you just want to be that guy's best friend. He's so sweet.
He is the hero of the movie.
Sam's the hero.
Carries Frodo, saves all sorts of people's butts. If it wasn't for Sam.
He's the anchor.
Absolutely. He's the best character. You know what drove me nuts? While we're on lists of things that drove us nuts. We talked earlier about how there's all kinds of unnecessary things in the dialogue for the sake of being big and fantasy and what have you. To the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Well, they know where the bridge is. They're all in Moria to get Gandalf. They know where that. Anyway,
The thing is, they don't know where the bridge is. They've never been there. But
that's
naming it's not going to help.
Yeah, it's not going to help at all. Just like, guys, that way. But no, you can't say that in Lord of the Rings. But what bothered me was the orcs. Because whenever an orc speaks, half of the time is dedicated to the line, and the remaining half is hissing noises. Like, I greet you by saying, "Hi, Dustin." An orc would say, "Hi, Dustin." And that's, like...
Was that the goblins or the orcs?
No, the goblins...
It's really hard to tell the difference. I know it's racist, but I have a hard time
wow, buddy.
telling the difference between an orc,
I'm
a goblin,
turning the mic
and
off.
Uruk-hai.
I'm sorry, everyone.
I don't want to be. I don't hang out with enough. I'm sorry.
Grew
We're
up
gonna
in rural Alberta.
We're gonna have a PSA after the show.
He's real sheltered, guys. Cut him some slack. But I hope they toned it down in the other movies. I can't remember, but as it was happening, I was like, stop mugging and just give your lines.
That's one of the
Have
things
some
that
cough
drove
syrup,
me.
damn it.
That's one of the things that drove me nuts about when the Uruk-hai were born, because like I thought the idea was cool and I thought the build-up was cool, and then when they're born, it was kind of cool because he was all wet and weird and goopy, and Saruman is doing his weird like talk and whatever about how, you know, orcs used to be elves and blur, words and words, but then when he's like, go off and I need you to go and find these guys and kill these guys. And then there's that getting ready montage. And it was such a weird getting ready montage where they're painting each other with the hands and just and like weird camera shakes and zooming and panning and people jumping up and down. And I was like, this is not exciting. This is kind of comical and weird. And then they start running and that leads directly into the whole river and the helicopters and...
And
Mr. Frodo, I hear the choppers.
the funny thing is, while I was watching that scene, I was thinking back to all that weird nonsense he did with the elves. So I'm like, you know what? He's not showing a transparent Saruman face. Like, this is okay. This is all right. He could be worse. Peter Jackson can always be worse. Google Meet the Feebles.
Everybody watch Meet the Feebles. And Bad Taste. And Dead Alive.
Now I'm probably locked into doing a commentary for Meet the Feebles with Dustin.
Done and done.
Like
I know unnecessary background shit about that movie too.
I have an old friend that I don't like very much that made me watch most of Peter Jackson's filmography. And first of all, that friend is a trash person. And second of all...
You're not getting paid for these critiques, by the way.
Okay, pizza's on you then. But like, Peter Jackson is, first of all, real dedicated to practical effects. You see that to great effect in Lord of the Rings, to terrible effect in Dead Alive.
He uses an actual M4 in Meet the Feebles.
But, oh, wow, he's so
live ammo.
like, and some of his early films are genuinely brilliant. Forgotten Silver is gorgeous. Peter Jackson can be, but often doesn't choose to be subtle. And I think a lot of the things that we're seeing in Lord of the Rings that are bothering us, even though I still love the movie, are Peter Jackson can be, but chooses not to be subtle. Like, he could tone down the helicopter shots, or he could have 1 million.
I do think he would go hyperbolic to, like, really sell it.
Yeah.
I do think that's what it is. I think it was enthusiasm. I think it was... It wasn't a lack of skill or a terrible storyteller. Just...
He can be subtle. He chooses not to.
Just thought, this is cool. And also, anybody who knows anything about the making of these films, there was, like, 3 or 4 units running simultaneously that he would sit there directing whatever actors, and there were like 3 or 4 other crews in other places in New Zealand all filming, and they were like beaming what they were filming onto screens where he was so that he could review footage.
He lost a lot of weight. Like he worked himself to the bone on these films.
So like a lot of the maybe awkward shots might have just been him just not being there, just not being able to shoot absolutely everything that was being done. He probably wasn't there for those Urukai shots. He might have been off shooting the Fellowship because that was kind of his job. And I think that stuff sort of got better as time went on. By the time he's in the Hobbit movies, he's got Andy Serkis as his second unit director doing anything that he's not doing, and those two basically share the same brain when they're directing, I guess. And they've got a really good collaboration going between themselves. So this is also the biggest movie that Peter Jackson's ever done up to this point.
Yeah, by far.
Easily.
Especially since I do, so a lot of people consider it to be pretty much one movie. The story was initially supposed to be one book that was cut into 3 by the editor, wasn't it?
Publisher.
And it is framed to fit sort of that. You've got 9 hours worth of movie that he's trying to pump out here. 12 if you're talking extended cuts and all that. It is a big undertaking.
Well,
so many
2
extras.
Years.
2 years.
It was like 2 years nonstop.
It wasn't only Peter Jackson's biggest undertaking, but I think it set a mark for the size a film could be. It harkens back to, and I'm carrying through on my threat to talk about this, it harkens back to the days of the old MGM historical epics, where the spectacle of scale was kind of a motivating factor. It was a reason people went to see movies, and it was a big draw, just like those huge Colosseum scenes in Ben-Hur, Cleopatra's entrance. And as special effects got more advanced, that kind of filmmaking kind of faded away. And then Lord of the Rings is like, but wait, movies can be huge. Want to see how huge a movie can be? I have a helicopter, come with me. And it was like, there's a real sense of wonder from like everybody who went to see it about, again, how huge it was. And I loved that about it. I still love that about it. I'm always going to love that about the Lord of the Rings movies.
I do think there was a part of Peter Jackson that was also saying, hey world, look how awesome New Zealand looks. Bring more films down here. I think there was a part of it that was a bit of an advertisement.
New Zealand might have been a bit of a sponsor and been like, make sure New Zealand comes off looking
Actually, I think it literally was. I actually literally think Tourism New Zealand.
There might have been grants. I don't know.
There might have been. But I did see an ad recently for like Hobbiton. Like you could go on vacation and go visit Hobbiton. And I want to.
The first one was not made to last.
Yeah.
But when they made the Hobbit movies and they recreated it, they were like, let's make it so that people can actually come and visit.
I want to. I want to go there.
We should start a Kickstarter.
Absolutely.
Except that's not an artistic thing.
Do a special...
We'll do a special episode.
Yeah, a special on location for your consideration episode that's just commentary on all of the Lord of the Rings.
For your consideration on location. That's great.
Wow. All Lord of the Rings, all the Hobbit movies, you watch them on location in Hobbiton.
We'll do commentaries.
Make jokes about how big you feel in there.
We'll do interviews. I do appreciate the lack of songs. I know that they added songs in the extended edition, and they kind of went to town in the Hobbit movies with the songs. I really do appreciate their
restraint.
Their restraint. I really appreciated their restraint in not just... I mean, Tolkien put a lot of songs in that book.
Having heard the full audio books for all of these movies about a half dozen times driving like hundreds of hours back and forth to BC, they did the songs. I did not miss them.
The funny thing is, I'm pretty sure that they actually added a song in the Two Towers that wasn't in the book.
Is it a song that Arwen sings or something?
Eowyn's dirge. Eowyn's song for her dead cousin.
And they took that from the Silmarillion or something, right?
Well, no, that's literally Old English. Like, we translated in my Old English course.
Okay.
So, and that's a song about how, like, Belo Qualm have the Freone Frecon forth on Sended. Yeah, but Tolkien was a noted Anglo-Saxonist. If you study Beowulf, you still study his essays on Beowulf. So if you're going to add a song to Lord of the Rings, yeah, write it in Old English. That's how Tolkien would have done it.
What did you guys
He
think?
probably would have made up his own language.
That's how Tolkien would have done
That's
it.
how Tolkien does it.
Did you guys think the score had enough variation, or did you think they just kept hammering home that those two themes, basically the orc theme and the fellowship theme?
Honestly, I didn't really notice the score in this one. For me, as
that's
we
a good
all
sign.
know, yeah, as we all know, usually if I don't notice a score, it's probably doing its job right.
Yeah, I noticed the times that they decided that the score was going to take a back seat. Frodo puts on the ring. Now we're going quiet. Now we're off in sound effects town. They've got a lot of control over things like how loud the music is playing, whether the music needs to be the focal point, not just of the scene, but at this point in the scene. But as far as particular themes, I didn't actually really notice a ton of them. I noticed the main themes, yeah, but for the most part, I guess like Dustin, I wasn't paying attention.
Ouch.
I knew I was supposed to, too.
You were too busy watching the bad compositing with the elves.
It was so terrible.
Elrond's especially. Oh, there was 4 things on the screen at once.
It's like the
over
Bohemian
Frodo's
Rhapsody
face.
video where the heads are like floating around.
I have a lot of very legitimate criticisms of this movie. I mean, I still love it. I still genuinely love this movie. I love all 3 of the movies with all of my horrible little heart. Two Towers is my favorite. I think all the things I said about the way shots are put together, the way color is used, the way lighting is used in Fellowship is better in the Two Towers. Two Towers is better at the things Fellowship does right. I still love Fellowship, like, a lot.
It is kind of an interesting... Like, ultimately, the Fellowship fails.
They suck.
I mean, it's something I knew going in, but watching it this time, I don't think I really thought about sort of the implications of what that meant from sort of a character standpoint, where all of these characters who were just all gung-ho and we're off to Mount Doom and we're going to take the ring, this is going to be great.
They kept the songs, by the way, or added in new ones in the old cartoon versions, and that actually reminded me of an old song that was
We
from
haven't
that.
brought that up yet.
And then you have that moment where Frodo's like, I gotta go, and Aragorn's like, yep. And then later, Legolas is all, hey, let's go, we can catch up. And Viggo's doing his, stoic ranger thing, and he's like, we're not going with them, are we? And he's like, nah. But I actually got super excited, because first it was sad, because I sort of realized all these characters, their entire purpose for this entire film is a failure. Their whole venture... They're purposeless. And then he's like, well, I'm not going to let these 2 guys suffer at the hands of orcs, so let's go kill some orcs. And I was kind of charged by that. I'm like, yeah, you know what? I'll watch a movie with these guys going and killing some orcs.
That was actually a really good scene with all of them. That was the most character development Legolas and Gimli had, for sure. It was the only time they showed emotion. But yeah, it's almost a downer ending until he's like, no, you know what? Plan A failed. I'm making Plan B right now. We're not going to let those 2 get tortured and eaten. That would suck. Those guys... They got to do what they got to do. They'll get to Mount Doom or do whatever, but we can't help them. We can help these 2.
I know we touched a little bit on the acting, but you got more charged up by Viggo Mortensen's delivery of this line than you did by the constant swelling strings. Mm-hmm. The soundtrack wasn't what was making you excited about what was to come. It was the actors looking at the camera and giving you lines.
Well, to be fair, I think, I believe the Fellowship theme might have been playing in the background.
Yeah, that's
it's a
kind of
great
what I
theme.
wanted
I
at the time.
love that theme.
Yeah.
The only problem I had with that theme was just I felt it was overused. It kept coming back.
I think they gave him a moment of quiet for that line, and then they swelled it.
It might have been. But... And then they go running off, and Gimli's like, ha-ha!
And the cam, get back in the helicopter. Pretty sure that's how it went. But...
what a time to be a helicopter pilot in New Zealand, eh?
The real strength of the movie is in, it's really well acted. I don't think there was anyone that I would say was bad in it. I think Hugo Weaving has done better. I wouldn't say he's bad. I think he's done better.
I think coming off The Matrix, he was maybe a little too Mr. Anderson with his delivery.
Yeah.
Because Hugo's actually much more pleasant in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
His delivery's a little more natural. He's a little less punching every, wrapping his face around every syllable.
He has his moments. I think all of the moments where the hobbits do something ridiculous and he's just looking at them like, what the hell are these little people? I think are genuinely really funny and charming little kind of glimpses. But you're right, when he's actually actively delivering lines, he's quite aggressive.
To be fair, in The Hobbit, not much is going on. Now, he's got the end of the world is showing up. His daughter's trying to hook up with some human and get rid of her immortality. And now he's got to deal with this chump who got his ass stabbed up on a hill. He's having a bad day.
He keeps telling his friend Gandalf that he's going to come back with something, and what do you know? Like, 4 tiny people have latched onto Gandalf, and now they're in his house and they won't leave. Like,
just speaking of the acting still, I think the worst acting in that whole movie is the Council of Elrond. Because there's a lot of, faces and people delivering lines and...
Have-o-dad.
Let us just destroy it! Bam!
Have-o-dad, Dustin. I think, the one elven line Aragorn uses, like, have-o-dad, Legolas. I don't know why that stuck in my brain, but it did. That's just, I don't know, I think it's elven for, sit down and shut up.
But I think the best acting in there was Viggo, Ian McKellen, and maybe a little Frodo. But I think everybody else was kind of playing it up, where Legolas was a little too Legolas, and Gimli was a little too Gimli, and Boromir was all for the sake of Gondor.
He was very
all
Boromir.
Of their hats were very
Boromir.
Clean and very up
and
at the
Elrond
forefront.
would look at people like what, and then when Frodo's like, I'll do it, and he's got that eyebrow raise, he's like, it worked. He's going to take it away from here.
Well, Frodo comes in all nice and subtle, like, I guess I could sort of I know it's going to be hard and stuff, but
he's like, I'll do it. You guys suck.
It's got to get done.
I'll do it.
Yeah.
Someone got to be an adult here.
And I love the shortest of us. I love that Ian McKellen moment where he you could just the muscles relax and his whole being. He's he's so sad.
God, I don't have to do this myself.
He's so sad that Frodo is taking on this burden, but he's also so thankful that Frodo's taking on this burden.
I'm kind of proud of him. He looks like just like I knew you'd come through for the little buddy.
If I had to do it, I know the eagle. I know if I had to do it, then the Eagle King would be all up on me about owing him a favor forever. I mean, sure, this way's a lot longer and more difficult, but I don't want to owe that guy nothing.
But I think I really like that Gandalf is basically just like an anthropologist studying these weird people who live in the middle of nowhere, and no one else in Middle-earth takes him or hobbits seriously. And it's
they even bring up the fact that he smokes a little too much of that hobbit weed.
Yeah, there's you've been getting high with the little people out in Little Peopletopia, and now one of them has the Ring of Power. Fucking Gandalf. But I think they go into a little bit more in the books, just Gandalf's hobbit anthropology and how he's made his life studying hobbits. I don't know if somebody were to come to my town and just be like, yeah, I'm studying your people, I'd be like...
That is something that I wish came through a little bit more in the movie.
Yeah.
It would have been cool because, I mean, you sort of have to have knowledge of the Hobbit to understand, because it's through Gandalf's relationship with Bilbo that he sort of falls in love with sort of the life, this pastoral life that the Hobbits have, where they're just unaffected by the world around them, and it's so charming and quaint to him. And
you guys and your little hippie communes.
And he's also so impressed by what somebody so little can accomplish, right? I mean, it's there, but I don't think it's there as much as I would like it to be there.
Yeah, actually, Gandalf doesn't really get developed as well as I think I'd like. But, I mean, it's a 3-hour movie. How much space do you have? But
and Gandalf has to die and then come back in the next movie as Gandalf the White, so...
Yeah, spoilers for Two Towers.
This is a spoiler show. Is there anything that we haven't covered about this movie that we want to cover?
We talked about how much I like Sean Bean. We talked about how much I don't like orcs.
Do you guys feel this movie holds up technically? We're talking a lot about
other
the quality of certain things, but we're not really talking about the special effects and stuff. It stood out to me. I didn't hate it. It wasn't a detraction, but I was like, wow, this movie has aged.
For me, I always judge a movie's special effects on the time that it was made. And it stood up, special effect wise, minus those elven overlay scenes.
Those were
because
terrible.
those were god awful. But everything else lived up quite well, and since so much of it is practical effect anyway, that's going to live forever.
Those weird overlays would have been out of place in the 90s. They're ancient. They were state of the art in the 50s. But
White Zombie was actually one of the first movies to do that with the eyes and the constant Bela Lugosi stare, and that was 32.
Spoiler warning for the episode about White Zombie.
They made that in 2 weeks?
11 days.
11 was 11 days. 11 days. Peter Jackson, you can do better overlay than White Zombie did. Come on.
My kind of barometer is the Star Wars prequels, because they were made in an era that was really high on CGI, that was really big on CGI.
They were made at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And when you watch like Phantom Menace now and Fellowship now, one of them holds up better. And it's the one I think that relied less on the CGI at the time. I will fight you. I swear to God. I don't care whose podcast this is. I will fight you with my fists. Am I not supposed to?
This is not a defense of the prequels episode. I think it holds up. There's a few scenes, like when Gandalf first meets Saruman at the tower and Saruman's coming down the steps. It looks like a composited image, and when Gandalf is riding and there's that faux helicopter shot because it's actually a digital shot, it felt a little conspicuous. There's a few scenes that just feel a little bit cut and pasted together.
Get to the full chopper. No, that is valid. There are some.
I just wondered if you guys kind of had the same reaction.
The only times when the special effects stood out for me were, once again, that overlay and the ring wraith. Whenever he put on the ring, like the warbling around the sides, it seemed pretty lame. Everything happening on the inside was good, but just the outside of the screen just looked a little off to me.
Yeah, that's... Well, speaking of Frodo putting on the ring effects, I think that they're really typical of like one of the few times that Peter Jackson showed restraint, because instead of having like a distortion where Frodo is at all times, they briefly show one, he vanishes. I thought the vanishing effect was really elegant.
Yes.
It was
Very
definitely...
much so.
A lot of people do vanishing effects with these weird distortions moving through the screen. And he's like, no, he's invisible. You can't see him. And I thought that was an excellent choice. And it prevented it from aging worse than it could have. Because, man, if he'd gone full CGI with that, it would not have aged great.
I do like the fact that, again, jumping ahead to The Hobbit, he talked about when Frodo puts the ring on in The Hobbit, the effect is different. And he said because at the time of The Hobbit, the invisible world that he's in, the ring doesn't have as much power.
And Sauron wasn't there doing whatever he was doing.
So things are less chaotic. And he said when we're in the time of The Lord of the Rings, when he first puts that ring on in Fellowship and everything's kind of torrential and stormy and all the noise and the distortion, he was like, that's because the ring was starting to swell with power and Sauron's power was growing, and, you know, everything was sort of coming to a head. And so that's why they did that effect, which I thought was kind of cool. Okay, so we should probably roll into the judgment segment of the show.
I was thinking we would do a 3-hour podcast.
That would be fitting.
It would absolutely
It could be an
be
epic
fitting.
podcast.
It would be extremely...
Or we could do 3 parts.
Ooh.
We could do all 3 films.
I would be down for that. I love the Two Towers because Bela Quilm Havath Freone Fregon Forthon said did.
Considering how often we've brought up the Two Towers and the films as a whole.
The next one's going to be about Fellowship, which we didn't talk about today.
Judge our own memories.
Should the guest get the first crack, or should the guest close us out?
You see, I was hoping that I could wait until there was a tie and then rule against Mike. No, wait, rule against... I can't decide which of you I want to lose more. I think I've gushed a whole lot about the movie, even though I have a ton of very valid criticisms of it, and I said a lot of mean things. I've also done a lot of gushing, and I think it holds up. I think it's a classic for what it did for nerd movies. Fantasy fiction kind of came back into vogue. People dressed up a little bit more like dragons, and that kind of made my days worse. It showed us things that we didn't think could be done in cinema anymore. It took us to faraway lands. It took us to places very high above faraway lands.
In helicopters.
Yeah. It showed us what Orlando Bloom looks like when he's thinking about something that he will never voice. So yeah, I love it. It's classic. Yeah.
But would you consider it a museum piece or a masterpiece? Is this one of the greatest films of all time?
Oof.
Now, considering we've all said that Two Towers is probably the better movie, that might...
I have that dilemma that I feel like the Oscar voters have, where I can't say all 3. Can I say all 3 Lord of the Rings movies are masterpieces? Can I only say 2 of them? Because, I feel like it's 3 or 1. I feel like when I get mad at Return of the King and I make it 2, I'm going to look like a jackass. But I am going to say yes. I think it's...
You're going to go masterpiece?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's one masterpiece.
I do.
When it comes to judging this movie, it's different from a lot of the other ones that we've done, because this is... Yes, it's a fantasy, which is slightly different. It's also directly taken from a book. And yeah, some of the other movies we've done have had books. Gone with the Wind was a book. But this is an interpretation that a lot of people didn't think was even possible. And going into it, I also was concerned that, is he going to be able to bring up all the stuff that I thought Middle-earth would look like? And he did. He succeeded at that. And being able to translate from a fantasy novel into cinema in a way that we'd all recognize and say, yes, that is now what Middle-earth looks like to me. It's overwritten anything that I would have thought of it looking like before. That takes a lot. And one more step is that it is the first part of 3. And I cannot separate all 3 of them when it comes to saying, is this a masterpiece or a museum piece? It is absolutely a museum piece. As a masterpiece, all 3 of them together are a masterpiece. I cannot say, you can't watch the movie and just have it by itself. When we saw it initially in theaters, we knew the other 2 were coming. It's not like Star Wars. When you saw Star Wars the first time, you didn't know there was 2 more coming. Here, we knew exactly how many were coming. We'd read all 3 stories. It isn't 3 stories, it's 1 story. It's like the Deathly Hallows Part 1, Part 2. No, it's The Lord of the Rings. It's 1 story, and I'm judging all 3 of them, so if and when we do the other 2, I am calling them masterpiece and giving this a shortened version of this spiel. That all together, it is a masterpiece. Separate, it is not. You can't just say, yeah, watch this one, but don't worry about the other 2. It's 1 story.
I feel like when Kat said having that dilemma that the Oscar people probably had, because I agree with you. I want to judge this the way I judge Star Wars because of what I mentioned earlier. I want to judge this as 1 story. I want to judge it not as a
series, but as a single film.
AFI chose Fellowship and Oscars chose Return of the King. I don't think anybody can really decide how they want to judge these movies.
I don't think anyone chose right.
But if I had to, if he took me to the mat and said you had to decide, I would say museum piece, not masterpiece. Because ultimately, I really liked when Kat said the invisibility effect was elegant, because that really crystallized for me. As much as I love this movie, as much as I love the scenery and the stuff that Weta did with the costumes and the digital work, there's just so much to love about this movie, but I think it lacks a certain elegance, which I think is the clumsiness in the editing and some of the dialogue, which is why I would go museum piece over masterpiece. But I don't know if that's right to judge it in that way because of everything that you had said. So I kind of feel like this movie is breaking our format.
Yeah, just all of us return a verdict of needs more information.
I need an RFI here done.
Not applicable.
And the thing is, we joked a lot leading up to this, Dustin and I, about how the Oscar voters, by the time they hit the 3rd movie, felt they had to give it to Peter Jackson no matter what, even though he's up against City of God and Mystic River and what have you.
And City of God is a badass movie.
Damn skippy it is.
We laughed a lot about that.
It's so much better than Return of the King.
now that we find ourselves in that situation, it's you do kind of have to judge it as a whole, because it's one thing. The films are discrete things, but they're not installments. They're not a story and a sequel and a threequel. I don't know, the 3rd one. It's 1 story. It's 1 thing. So
it always has been and always will be.
And there's no Oscar category for best 3-part whole thing. So
it's kind of 3 votes for museum piece, 2 votes maybe for masterpiece.
I'm saying it absolutely is not. No. As a standalone film, it is not a masterpiece.
Yep.
As 1 big film, it is.
Yeah. I think I agree with Dustin. I think Fellowship might not be a masterpiece. Lord of the Rings as a whole entirety thing, I would call a masterpiece.
I think I'm on board with that.
So despite the fact that we thought there'd be disagreements, we're all in agreement.
I was actually prepared to menace someone.
That does actually bring up an interesting thing, which is we talked about possibly doing the other movies. Does anybody want us to do the other movies and continue this very long, meandering conversation about Jackson and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings?
Here's what we can promise you if you back our next 2 episodes Kickstarter. More helicopter shots jokes, more orc impressions, more yelling at Dustin. I think we can promise at least 30% more yelling at Dustin.
Also more Ent impressions and Andy Serkis impressions. Absolutely. Or Golems.
Yeah, I will greet you personally using your name as an orc if you contribute more than $100 to our Kickstarter.
Now, if you want to contact us officially in a very real manner to let us know, you can find us on Facebook. We're on Twitter at FYC Show. Show's also on Instagram. We're available on Stitcher and iHeartRadio. All the social medias. We're out there. You can find us. We'd love to hear what you think. If you get the show off of iTunes, like tons of people do, so we'd love it if you took a minute to rate and review the show. At least rate the show. 5 stars is great, but
6 stars is better.
Rate us how you feel. It just helps with the podcast standings and getting the word out for the show. We like doing the show. If you're listening, you probably like hearing the show. So let's keep this show going. Get the show on the road.
Keep this show on the road.
Keep the show on the road. I'm imagining like the Fellowship walking on a road right now.
So are we going to fade out to play the Fellowship theme? Just
Well,
send the microphone on a helicopter far away.
The Fellowship theme is playing right now in the background.
What if the Fellowship theme is playing and then Mike starts singing over top of that?
Oh, can we play a helicopter sound effect to end out the episode?
So that brings another episode to a close.
Thanks for joining us, Kat.
Happy to.
Thanks so much, Kat. It's great having you here.
It was fun.
Hope you join us again.
I would love to. I have some strong feelings about Cleopatra.
I believe that's on the list. And Eraserhead. I hear you have straight.
Oh, do not. I have a friend, an old friend, that I don't like very much.
So thanks for joining us. Thanks for your support. Join us next week. I'm Mike.
I'm Dustin.
I was Kat.
Ta-ta.
Take care.
Bye. Now we're going quiet. Now we're off in Sound Effects Town. And that was... Sound Effects Town is where the Wraiths have faces. But...
It sounds like a old 70s prog rock song. A Rush song.
The first single on our new album.
Sound Effects Town is where the ringers have faces. They ride their horses to all the remote places. Looking for the ring.
Yeah, no, he's right. That's what it sounds like.
That's also going into the end. I know where that edit's going.